When it comes to investing in property, almost everyone wants to get positive cash flow straight out of the gate. Today, I'm going to show you though that if you can afford, say, $200 a week or $300 a week, how by focusing on negative cash flow property, you can actually end up way more wealthier and you can get that passive income that you're after as well. Hello, it's Nero here, and let's begin by looking at a scenario where you buy, let's say, a $600,000 property. Now, in this example, I'm going to assume that you're going to borrow 100% of the purchase price plus the stamp duty, maybe your buyer's agent's fees, legal costs, everything. Okay, you're not going to use any of your own money. You're going to use more than likely equity that you've got either in your own home or an existing investment property. All right, so you buy this property, it's going to cost you $600,000. Then we do our full cash flow analysis. So what that means is you look at the annual rental income, then you take away your expenses like the property management fees, insurance costs, rates, etc. You end up in a scenario where this property costs you around about $250 per week in this example. Now, let's assume then that this property rises on average by 6.8% per annum. Now, where did I get that figure from? Well, according to this study from Aussie Home Loans and CoreLogic, the average annual price growth in houses in Australia has been 6.8%, but that was only up until 2018. Since 2018 to 2024, I'd say property price growth in multiple areas has been a lot higher than that, but I'm just trying to be as conservative as possible for this example. So let's stick with 6.8% growth. Now, as you can see in this spreadsheet, that means that after year one, the property has risen to $640,800. Year two, it's worth $684,000, and it keeps increasing until in year 8, your property is now worth over $1 million. And if it keeps going, by year 15, your property is now worth over $1.6 million, which means your property has increased in value by over $1 million. Now, of course, no area and no property rises by the exact same amount each year. So I'm simply using an average growth rate here of 6.8% per annum. Some years your property might rise by more than 6.8% for the year. In other years, it might rise by less than that. So as you can see in this example, you bought a property for $600,000. Within 15 years, you've made over $1 million in gross capital gain. But there's a few other things here to consider. First of all, this property cost you $250 per week, as we said. But if you've done this correctly, you should be buying in an area where rents are rising. Let's assume that rents rise by an average of $50 per week. What that means is then that if the rental income is rising by $50 per week, your cash outflow, how much this property is costing you each year, should reduce by that same $50 per week. Because if your income is rising and your expenses are staying the same, then the net position is that your cash outflow is reducing by $50 per week. So what that means is that when you started, this property cost you $250 per week. In a year's time, it now only costs you $200 per week. In 2 years' time, it should cost you only $150 per week, again assuming rents are rising by $50 per week every year, which means within 5 years, this property is now cash flow neutral. It's not costing you anything. Therefore, from that point onwards, this property will be giving you a net positive income. Yes, it'll start off small, but over time, it's going to increase. So what can you do with this property that's rising in value and where rents are rising? Well, you can then use this property as a stepping stone to buy another property. And let's say that you're extremely risk averse, you're really trying to watch your cash flow, and you're not in any major hurry. You want to do this slowly. So let's say that you buy that first property and you don't do anything for another 6 years. So then you decide, okay, you bought this property for $600,000. It's now worth over $890,000 in this example. Let me use the equity that I've got in that property, plus the fact that it's now no longer costing you anything, to go and buy another $600,000 property, obviously in a different area. And let's say again, that property costs you $250 per week. So now you're in a position where you have 2 investment properties, one worth $890,000, the other now worth $600,000. So your portfolio is worth $1.49 million, but it's only costing you $250 per week. And to buy that second property, you've again borrowed 100% of the purchase price plus all your costs. That's the assumption under which we're working. Now, let's say you do nothing else and you just let these two properties grow in value by 6.8% per annum, which, as I said earlier on, is just the long-term average. We're not looking at anything unrealistic here whatsoever. Now, let's allow another 5 years to pass. You've done nothing else. You're very conservative. Your first property is now worth over $1.2 million. And the second property that you bought is worth over $800,000. So what that means is that come year 5, after you've bought the second property, or year 11 from when you first started, you now have a total portfolio that's worth over $2 million and giving you a positive cash flow. Why? Well, property number 2 is now cash flow neutral. But remember, property number 1 was already cash flow positive back when you bought the second property. So 5 years have gone past, rents have increased again. That first property is giving you positive cash flow. So you're now in this amazing position where you have a $2 million portfolio that's giving you positive cash flow. Let's now allow another 4 years to go past. So you're not going to do anything else. You're being really, really conservative. Well, that means that property number 1 is going to be worth over $1.6 million. Property number 2 is worth over $1 million. So $2.6 million in total portfolio value. Remember, you bought property number 1 for $600,000 back 15 years ago now. You bought property number 2 for also $600,000 back around about 9 years ago. So you bought a portfolio for $1.2 million, and now that portfolio is worth over $2.6 million and giving you positive cash flow. That's a gross equity uplift of $1.4 million. And you haven't taken any huge risks. You've been very, very conservative. You've just bought good quality properties and then let time do the work for you. But how could you do this even faster or look to get even better results? Well, one of the easiest ways is to look for areas that are likely to outperform the national average. So instead of looking at areas that maybe grow on average by 6.8% per annum, maybe look at areas where you can get capital growth on average for 8% per annum. That means that, again, if you do nothing else, you are still as conservative as you were, you still have the two properties, you end up with a portfolio that, instead of being worth $2.6 million after 15 years, which is still good, is now worth over $3.1 million. An extra $500,000 in gross equity uplift simply by doing your due diligence and targeting the better areas. Or maybe you decide to be a little bit less conservative. You buy one property now, you buy a second property 6 years later, and then you buy a third property 6 years later again. So 12 years after you bought the first property. Again, let's assume $600,000 is the cost of that property. So you're obviously moving around and buying in different areas, and the property is costing you $250 per week. So now what happens? Well, let's project to the 15-year mark now. You've got 3 properties. The entire portfolio is positively cash flowed, and it's worth over $3.8 million. Remember, over the time that you bought 3 properties at their cost price each of $600,000, which means a total portfolio cost of $1.8 million. Your portfolio is now worth $3.8 million plus. You've made over $2 million in gross equity uplift, plus you've got positive cash flow. And again, you've been very, very conservative. Now, of course, if you can afford more than $250 per week, maybe you might buy properties more quickly and then let time do its thing. Either way, the key thing to understand here is that the sooner you get started, if you can afford these sorts of numbers, the more time you will have on your side. And the key to property investing, the key to achieving wealth safely, is to have time on your side. So even if you're 50 here and just getting started, by the time you reach 65 in this very conservative plan, you can have an extra $2 million of gross equity uplift. Plus, you can have passive income, positive cash flow coming in as well. Now, of course, you can do this faster, as I said, in multiple different ways. One of them is to buy properties more frequently if your risk profile and your cash flow and borrowing capacity allows it. But even if it doesn't, here's a simple plan that will allow you to achieve some significant wealth in 15 years or less. And finally, if you want to find areas that are more than likely going to outperform the national average of 6.8%, like we often do for our clients, then here are some of the key factors you need to look at. Number one, demand being higher than supply. Are there more people moving into this area who want to buy property to live versus the number of available properties for sale and the number of properties that can be built? That's the first criteria you want to look at. Second of all, what about the jobs growth in and around the area? Is this an area where people can move into and there's lots of jobs in and around where they can go to for work or work remotely, whatever the case happens to be? Then you also want to look at the economic growth of the area. Is there lots of money sloshing around that local economy? If you can look at just those three factors, yes, there are some others you need to consider, but if you can look at just those three factors, you're going to have a much better chance of finding areas that are likely to outperform the national average. And look, if you want a full detailed blueprint of how to create wealth through property so you can then get that passive income over time, click the link in the description below to get totally for free the audio version and digital version of my book. It is a full property investing blueprint based off my now 22 years of investing in property all around Australia. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.